and I'll try and live up to what Kirby says tonight. So I'm the historian at the MDT, as you probably know, and a lot of my job these days is researching transportation history. And I get to do that mainly for my own edification, but also because I get a lot of questions, and people want to know about stuff. And I don't want to make things up like a lot of historians do. And so I do a lot of research, and it's great, and my agency indulges me in it, and so actually I think for a historian I've got the perfect job right now, except for maybe Kirby's. Kirby's is pretty good too, and so is Becca's back there. So, but anyway, I'll do my best to be entertaining tonight. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about roads leading to Helena. I bet you knew that. And this is something I've really kind of been really interested in for a long time. I did grow up in Billings until I was 10 years old, and then I lived here in Helena ever since. And my dad is from here, and his family are all from here. So I'd heard a lot about the roads to Helena when I was growing up. And but what I learned was mostly wrong. But I haven't told my dad that, and he hasn't seen this program, so it's probably a good thing. But anyway, so I'll just kind of jump into it since I've only got an hour, and there's probably going to be some questions at the end, at least I hope. So anyway, anybody know what street this is in Helena?
Benton.
Nope, not Benton. No, you wouldn't believe what street this is. All right, this is Vawter Street.
What?
Vawter Street. And now, of course, you can hardly drive up there anymore, but still pretty steep. And just to give you a heads up, how you know that the retaining walls there behind the Blackfoot Brewing Company. How many of you have heard that's part of the Benton Road? Nobody's heard that. I grew up with that. You know, this is the Benton Road up here, and the tour train used to tell everybody that, and I'd just sit there and shake my head, and until they stopped doing that. But actually, that's the road that went to Unionville. That's up on the hill behind the Blackfoot Brewing Company and by the library there. So it's a very interesting little road feature from territorial times that we really don't have many of those around anymore. So thankfully, I don't think it's going anywhere unless we have an earthquake, and then I think we'll probably lose it. But with that, I'll go ahead and jump in. Anybody know who this gentleman is? This is the father of road building in Montana. He's also the father of bridge building. Here, this is John Mullen. In his younger days, we're used to seeing the photographs of him where he's bald and he's got this big Duck Dynasty beard and all that. But this is what he looked like shortly after he left Montana. So John Mullen built the first engineered road in Montana. He built it starting in November of 1859. He finished it on July 29th, 1860. He finished it actually before the deadline, which is pretty unusual for road builders. Does anybody work for the MDT out here? Oh, Jim, you don't count. He built it on time by a day. I mean, he finished it a day early, and he was also about $50,000 over budget. So that seemed a little bit more reasonable to me. But John Mullen, again, he built the first engineered road. It connected Walla Walla, Washington with Fort Benton. And it was intended as a military route, supply route, and it was actually used in that capacity only once, and that was in August of 1860. After that, it became a pretty well-used wagon road and a stagecoach route and so forth, except for the road west of Missoula, where it was a little bit too rugged and they had too many problems with the terrain over there, so that became mostly a pack trail. But Mullen's Road in this part of the country was really a well-used route. And one of the things it had going for it was the fact that it had actually been thought out and it had been surveyed and it was well taken care of. And at least for the first 2 years of the road's existence, that Mullen did actually do a lot of upgrades and did a lot of modifications and repairs to the road, so it kept it open. And so it was really, and there's still a lot of it around here that you can go walk. And fortunately, there's a retired doctor here in town, Rich Buswell, that knows where it went. And so we're going to take advantage of him this spring and go out and start recording segments of the Mullen Road that haven't been recorded yet. And that means taking photographs and GPSing them in so we can tell exactly where the road went, which now we're just kind of going from maps that were made in 1860, and it's not always that accurate. So, but the Mullen Road never actually came into Helena. It skirted the valley. It was up there just to the along Bird's Eye Road, pretty much, there on the west side of town, and then turned over to go over the mountains there at Austin, and then went over Mullen Pass. So, but it never actually came into Helena Valley. But Mullen was well aware of this valley anyway. He had a lot of hopes for it, and he looked at it mostly as an area where there would be farming. And so he said in his report to Congress in 1863, he said, crossing the divide, we get into a new climate and change of soil. Along the Big Prickly Pear Creek will be found several small and choice localities for farms, and if the mines are successful on the western slopes, on the eastern slopes, I look forward to, with much hope, to see all these creeks settled and fine farms developed under the hand of the Rocky Mountain farmer. So he did know about the valley, but he never actually, the road never actually came in here. So here's just a quick map of the Mullen Road itself. You can kind of see it right following along here, and then it goes over the mountains and then it goes down Little Blackfoot Valley all the way to Garrison, and then it follows the Clark Fork all the way to Missoula. So it's a well-known Aboriginal route. The Indians used it for thousands of years, and Mullen just kind of took it and made it a better road made it a suitable road for wagons. All right. It's also one of the first signs that we put up, the Highway Department put up in 1935, was about the Mullen Road, and you can still see the descendant of this original sign over on the west side of the pass now, next to US Highway 12. It doesn't look as good as this one does, but just to let you know that the Highway Department was very well aware of the importance of the Mullen Road very early on in the last century. So you can go up and again see pieces and parts of it. It's still there. Rich Buswell took us up to look at this. This is the Mullen Road right here. Can you kind of see the wagon ruts going across? And it's really kind of hard to see a lot of the times, but there it is. It's still up there. And then Rich just told me that he found 2 other sets of ruts as well. So I may be pointing out what's not actually the Mullen Road, because it might be one of the other sets of ruts that are crossing over Mullen Pass today. So that's something we're going to have to work on this summer, is to try and determine which route that is. And that I'll do on my own time and not on Highway Department time. So, but anyway. But the big impetus for road building in Helena, of course, was the discovery of gold in July of 1864. That you needed good roads, or at least passable roads, so that people could get here, and that's more importantly, so they could get the gold out. And so Helena very quickly after July of 1864 became kind of a transportation hub in southwestern Montana. We had the Mullen Road here, we had the Benton Road, we had the road down along Prickly Pear Creek down to Jefferson City and over the divide into the Boulder Valley. It's also the road down into Gallatin Valley. All kind of came together right here in Helena. Unfortunately, I haven't done any real documentation on the road down to the Gallatin Valley, other than, I know some of you will be really happy about this, the Highway Department. See, I've been there for a long time, so I can call them a Highway Department still. The Highway Department has actually programmed a project to build passing lanes just east of East Helena. So one of my jobs, or one of my responsibilities at the Highway Department, was to do a cultural resource survey to determine if there were any historic sites that might be impacted by that project. And in the process, I discovered that if you follow Highway 12 all the way down to Townsend, you're pretty much on the old road to Bozeman. That highway is following that old route, and they match up pretty closely with the original General Land Office maps. And I think that's kind of interesting, that a lot of these old roads that were first used in the 1860s, we're still using them today. And of course, in those days, you didn't need passing lanes like you do today. But some roads had turnouts where you could actually pull over and let other traffic come through during the territorial days. All right. Well, here's the kicker. In 1864, we became a territory in May of that year, and then the legislature first met in December of 1864, and that session went on until just at the beginning of February. So one thing the legislators did agree on, which they didn't agree on very much, kind of like, is there any legislators in here today? Kind of like today, they don't really agree on a lot of issues. But back then, they did agree with the fact that you needed good roads. But the problem in 1864 Montana is you didn't have any kind of you didn't have a way to tax people to do roads. That you had to find another system to do that. And you couldn't have property taxes or gasoline tax or anything like that. So you had to find another method of raising money to build roads. Well, they weren't really interested in doing that. And so what they did was something very clever, at least on the surface, but it turned out to be something very bad by the time that the program ended. And that is they chartered toll companies so that you could get a license or a franchise or whatever you want to call it from the legislature. They would grant it to you. You may put in a petition. They grant you this license, and then you could run a toll road or build a toll bridge. There was a specific amount of money you could charge people to use it. If you abused that, you ran the risk of losing the license. But a lot of them didn't do that. And with good reason is that it was a very lucrative franchise that they got. I mean, there was a lot of money to be made in collecting tolls in Montana. And there were a lot of toll facilities. So it's kind of interesting to hear a lot of the complaints about it in the long run was, well, you know, I'm paying so much in tolls that it ate all my profits away. And so if you're with the military and you have to cross a toll bridge, you have to pay per soldier and plus each supply wagon. So it got to be kind of a burden to the territory eventually. But at least at the beginning, it did what it was intended to do, and that was to create a road system in Montana. And so it was, you know, and a lot of those roads, again, are still being used today. This is just a general map. This is a general land office map. This is from the first survey the government did of the Helena area in 1868. And so you can kind of see where some of the Helena's right in here, I believe, and you can see where all these roads are. I think, is that right? Yeah, I haven't looked at this for a while, but I think Helena is right in here, so you kind of get an idea where all these roads are radiating out from it. So even as early as 1868, all these routes were very well established. And so I apologize for this. I didn't have time to get something from Photo Archive, so I had to get it off the internet. This is State Street here in Helena. That used to be Helena's main business district in the 1860s. It's a very busy place, and you can kind of get a feeling for what it was like by all the freight wagons that are lined up in a narrow street. And those freight wagons were, you know, critical to the prosperity and survival of Helena, at least in the early days. And some of you probably know what it's like going downtown even today when there's all the delivery trucks are there. It's hard to get around. And it was no different back then. But what they did was they had this little system worked out where the freighters would camp outside of Helena, and then they would just kind of trickle in as they could. And anybody have an idea where they camped? Kmart. They camped down there. It was called Moccasin Flat eventually, but that's where the campground was for the freighters, was down there at Kmart. And so a lot of those roads that came from there, you can still follow their streets today, essentially. All right. Stagecoaches are always going to be important to this as well, to carry passengers. But passengers wasn't the main thing that they were really there to carry. Anybody have an idea about that? This is like school, isn't it? I'm sorry. Well, the mail. The mail was really where the stagecoach companies made their money. And a lot of them had government contracts, so that if you were a passenger on the stagecoach, that you're going to be sharing space with mail sacks as well sometimes. How many of you have read a book called Roughing It by Mark Twain? If you haven't read it, it's really a great book, but he describes his voyage across the Great Plains in a stagecoach where the passengers were secondary to the mail. but they were actually able to make it a kind of a comfortable trip by laying on mail sacks and making beds and pillows out of mail sacks. But anyway, stagecoaches are part of this. I'm going to dispel a myth right now. Stagecoach travel was not fun, and it was not romantic, and everybody was glad to see the trains finally come to, the railroads come to Montana, because they didn't have to take these damn things anymore. And the reason is, again, you got to carry mail, you got to carry passengers, you got to carry gold, and so the whole idea is the stagecoach companies want to make as much money as they can, so they're going to cram as many people as they can inside the coach. They're designed for maybe 9 people, but they're going to try and get more. And then the tops of these things are going to be just covered with guys hanging on, trying to get a ride to wherever it is they're going. So I'll talk a little bit more about that here in the future. But stagecoaches were a necessary evil more than anything. And if you watch John Wayne's Stagecoach, that was actually a lot more fun than what it was for the people that actually rode these things. Okay, the next road I'd like to talk about is a toll road. It's the Benton Road. I'm sure all of you have heard about the Benton Road. Now, parts of the Benton Road are the Mullen Road, from about Fort Benton down to right about in here is all Mullen Road that was later adapted for the Benton Road. But from here on down, it's all toll road, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. One of them is probably one of the most famous toll roads in Montana. It's right down in this section right here, right when you go into the canyon here from the south. And it was called the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road. And Malcolm Clark, who had his ranch there where Seaman Flat is today, where the Bacchus Ranch is today, was one of the toll keepers along with another man named Ed Lewis. And so they had the contract or the license to run the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road for until whenever they lost it. And so they didn't do much development work to it. And so instead of the Mullen Road, which really skirted to the west of the canyon, they decided to build the road into the canyon and connect with the Mullen Road where it came down Lyons Creek and connected or joins Little Prickly Pear. So when you go up north to Great Falls, you've all been on that route, I'm sure. You know where that little parking area is. It's it used to be the Lyons Creek rest area. It was the first interstate rest area in Montana, by the way. And now it's a parking area, but that's where the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road joined with the Mullen Road, and they continued on north into Fort Benton, was at that spot right about there. So I need to put a sign up there at some point that talks a little bit about that. So I just reminded myself that. So the men didn't build any bridges. They had 27 fords across Little Prickly Pear Creek. It was very tortuous going through that canyon. It was very narrow then, even more like it is today. And so it really wasn't a very good road. And there were a fair number of complaints about it. So what happened in 1866, Malcolm Clark, ma'am, don't yawn or I'll start yawning too. Malcolm Clark and Ed Lewis sold the license to a couple of other guys named James King and Warren Gillette. And so those are the men that are really most associated with the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road. Now they spent about $40,000 upgrading that road. So when I did a little bit of a check, how many have any idea what $40,000 would be worth today? A lot. It's over $500,000. So I'm kind of thinking that might be a myth as well. That they probably did spend a lot of money, but $40,000 is a little bit too much. So, but they did make the changes. They did straighten it out. They built 9 bridges, got rid of all the fords. And that's when the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road really became an important freighting route into Helena, is after King and Gillette got a hold of it. The story goes, and I don't know if this is true, but I think it probably is, they were able to make back their $40,000 investment within 2 years. So you can see it really is a very lucrative job being a toll keeper in territorial Montana. That you were going to make money unless you were really bad at it, and there was none of them that were really that bad. So, whoops. Here's a photo of Warren Gillette. I told my wife I wanted to grow a beard like that, and she said I'd have to find another place to live. So I'm not going to. But anyway, that's Warren Gillette. And then this is what the road through the canyon looked like. This is one of Hugh Kirkendall's wagon or freight trains coming through here, probably around 1866, 1867. The secret is, and this is if anybody ever asks you, most of the time the freight wagons were pulled by oxen. And the reason being is that oxen could pull greater weights of supplies, but they were very slow, right? But what's the nice thing about oxen is they kind of live off the land as you're going along. So, but if you're in a hurry to get somewhere, if you have something that's perishable, then you're going to have mules. And so a lot of the photographs that we've got of the historic period it shows mule trains and not the old oxen freight trains. And when I was researching a book here, I'll talk about towards the end, I had a devil of a time finding a historic photograph of an ox train, and from the 1860s. I did find one eventually, and they almost cut it out of the book because it was too dark. But anyway, this is what they look like. I mean, there was pretty regular, steady traffic through the canyon in the 1860s. One of the things I like, this is one of the mule skinners here. These guys you could hear coming before you ever saw the wagon train, especially with the ox wagons, mainly because they were proficient in the use of profanity. And so and I've heard a lot of things about people say, yeah, I heard them coming before I saw them. And mothers are trying to keep their kids away from them and the whole works.
So is this a one-lane road?
Yeah, it's pretty much one lane. So, but there'll be places where you could pull off, probably, but mostly it's going to look like this. So none of these roads really, and I guess I should qualify this a little bit as well, that once you got to the Helena Valley, there isn't really one track for a wagon road. What it is they all spread out. And so that was mostly because nobody wanted to be the last guy in line, and because of the dust and everything else. So usually what you see is where they can, they usually spread out. So they're kind of like a big fan moving down towards Helena, so that nobody has to eat anybody else's dust. And also because they have better access to grazings for their animals as well. This again is one of my favorite photos, a little out of focus. I'll have to get a replacement, Becca, sometime. Do you know where this one's at? Okay. This is right down at the southern end of the canyon as you're driving towards Helena, and you look up there on your right, you can still see this up on the canyon walls. So I know about where this photo was taken, and this has also been one of my favorite photos because you really can't see it, but there's a guy sitting here fishing. And so he's got his wagon on this really primitive bridge. I mean, it's not a very good bridge, but it probably worked. And I always thought, I'd sure like to do that while I'm working sometime. But they would frown on it since I'd have a state car. And I know you guys would too because you're taxpayers, so I never do it. Bruce, you don't do that either, I hope. Okay, good. All right. Another view, this is not from the Little Prickly Pear Wagon Road. This is from the upper Little Prickly Pear Canyon Toll Road. These things are a mouthful sometimes. Now this goes from where the Bacchus Ranch is south through the canyon down to Silver City. And this one wasn't established till 1869. This part really wasn't part of the Mullen Road either. Apparently the Mullen Road was a little bit off to the offset from this. And we're going to find where that was too, hopefully soon. Dr. Buswell does know where that's at too, he says. But this again, I think this may be the same wagon train that's in the other photograph, but I can't exactly be sure. Now this toll road was owned by Nick Hilger, many of you may have heard of, and then another man named Billy Johns. And they only ran this thing for a couple of years. And then in 1870, the territorial legislature decided we'd had enough. The problem is that they've been receiving too many complaints from people about the toll roads. They were paying too much. The roads and the bridges weren't always being kept up very well. But mainly what it's doing is it's eating into our profits. And so eventually in 1870, the territorial legislature got rid of the toll bridge and toll road system. And then the counties took control of them. And then the counties could actually charter some sections as toll bridges and toll roads as well. So that did happen a little bit. The road over McDonald Pass that I'll talk about here in a minute was a toll road up until the late 19th century. The road down from about midway from south of Livingston to Gardner was a toll road very late too, after the railroad arrived. And so there were a few of them, but most of them were gone by 1870, 1871. All right. Again, another view of a stagecoach. I feel sorry for this little kid. This is in the Prickly Pear Canyon. And then this is one of my favorite photos because you see all these guys standing around. Probably all of them are going to try and get on top of that thing. So again, there was room for 9 people inside. And so I want you to think, you're cramming these people in, right? And some of these trips are in the summertime. And there's these nice, prim and proper Victorian age women riding in a stagecoach jammed in next to some dirty, disgusting miner. And so it's really the best democratic thing you could do. I mean, everybody's shoved in, the great unwashed and everybody else is shoved in together. There's a great list of things that you shouldn't do when you're in a stagecoach. One of them is you shouldn't swear if there's women present. A lot of them deal with whether there's women there or not. One of them is if you're going somewhere and there's women in there, don't point out where a robbery or a murder happened. Make sure if you're a man, you don't put a lot of hair oil in because it's dusty. And don't let your head lop over onto your neighbor because it's for the same reason. And so the rules, I should have brought them with me. They're really pretty funny, and they're pretty appropriate too, I think. It took about 2 or 3 days to get up to Fort Benton from Helena by stagecoach. There's stage stops all along the route, about every 10 miles or so. And then they had home stations that were a little bit further away. And at the home stations, you could get out and get a meal. From what I understand, you probably don't want to get a meal at a lot of them. These guys are all working under contract, and they don't, they put in a bid to do the work, and so a lot of the meals aren't really up to snuff. But really, you know, there's a lot of bad things about it, but it's really kind of an interesting period. Riding in a stagecoach, I'd almost like to do it once, but I think that would probably be enough.
About 5 miles.
About 5 miles, yep. My grandfather used to make us ride in a little mud wagon, they called it, down in Billings, and we thought that was the greatest thing in the world, but I couldn't sit on those benches anymore, I don't think. All right, here's a little piece of the road that still exists in Prickly Pear Canyon. If you take the old recreation road, old Highway 91, and you kind of look around as you're driving, hopefully, well, not while you're driving, but because of the way the road is, that you can see pieces and parts of the old road still. And there's a bridge about 2 miles south of Wolf Creek. It's called, crosses Sheep Creek. And if you're just to the north of that bridge, you can see this piece of it. You know, they're going around this kind of swampy area. But there's other sections too that you can follow all along as you're driving through the canyon. You can't see them very well from the interstate, but you sure can from the old highway. But that's also just see, they're not very wide. I mean, I think this thing's probably 10 feet wide at most, so they're not wide. And a lot of these roads, they weren't really built or engineered. The Mullen Road was engineered, but most of them just kind of growed from use. And they would get, whatever repairs needed to be done, but none of them are engineered. And so there's a lot of problems with a lot of them, but hardly any of them are really planned out with any great detail. Okay, and this is what the road looked like in the 1940s, shortly about 10 years after the highway was built through there. And so you can see, pretty much it's pretty treacherous even in the 40s. And you can imagine what it was like in the 1860s. But of course the traffic's moving a lot slower then as well. All right, another photo in 1960, I believe 1962, when they were building the interstate. Anybody remember when that was going on? You? Good. Good. So you all know this. They had to keep the highway open for traffic when they were building the interstate. And so I imagine it was quite a mess going on. Also had to keep the railroad open too. And so it was, must have been something to see. I just missed it. I was just not quite old enough. And then, of course, this is what it looks like now. This photo was taken in the 60s. So 100 years after the first road was built through the canyon. So I love it. That's my favorite piece of road in Montana. Interstate and Old Highway is driving up between Helena and Great Falls on the Old Highway. All right, now this is my favorite route. This is the Frenchwoman's Road. How many of you ever heard of the Frenchwoman? Oh, good. This will all be new for you. The Frenchwoman. Well, this is a historical marker that's about to be replaced. I just found out today. The old airway beacon on top of the pass is now listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So we're going to take this sign down and put something up about that. And then you know where that scenic overlook is on this side of the divide, that we're going to put a sign there talking about the Frenchwoman's Road where you can actually look down over the side and see it down below you. So you can't really see it from the vantage point of this sign, but you can from the other spot. So the Frenchwoman, we don't know what her first name was. Her husband's name was Constant Guillot. So she was Mrs. Guillot officially. We don't know what her first name was. We don't really know what she looked like. There's no photographs of her. We have a couple of descriptions of what she looked like. But she and her husband Constant, she was from France and he was from Canada, came to Montana in 1865 and they purchased a ranch in the Madison Valley. But by 1866, they were living over in the Elliston area. For whatever reason, I don't know, they moved up there and they were living probably at the base of Mullen Pass and probably taking advantage of the Mullen Road there. But in 1866, the territorial legislature granted Guillot a license to build a road over what we would call McDonald Pass today. And it just went from where the Mullen Road, down there about where that connects with, or just down about Elliston, and it just went over the divide into where it connected with 10 Mile Creek. So probably right down there, where the Remini Road comes out, or comes into the highway today. It was probably the length of what the Frenchwoman's Road was supposed to be. There was some problems, though. That Guillot wanted the license before he'd actually built the road. So the governor at that time, Green Clay Smith, didn't want to give him the license. And so there was quite a bit of wrangling between the legislature and the territorial governor about whether Guillot should get the license or not. But eventually, the legislature prevailed, Guillot got his license, and by 1867, he had built a road over McDonald Pass. And so, and in November of 1867, we do know that the road was in operation by then. But again, with a lot of toll keepers, the man who built the road or got the license didn't actually have much to do with the actual operation of the road. A lot of the times, if they were married, it was the wife that really got the responsibility of collecting tolls. Well, what Madame Guillot did was she built a cabin along the route, and she had a little hotel in there where you slept on the floor. Probably not really comfortable, but if you're tired, you'll sleep anywhere. And she also served meals. And she's kind of like the Steve's Cafe of her day, that people just loved the meals that she cooked. And so Madame Guillot's, the Frenchwoman's cabin, was really a popular stopping place for people traveling between Helena and the Deer Lodge Valley. So there's a lot written about that. But again, there's few descriptions of her, except two. One of them was written in the 1880s, called her, quote, a neat-looking critter, black-haired, black-eyed, and sharp, and cute-looking, maybe 30 years old, and a good housekeeper. I guess she had all the qualities they thought was important back then. But the one that's written more contemporary with her says, quote, a garrulous, gossiping, good-natured dispenser of ranch eggs and trout and tortured English. And so that's the one I kind of tend to look at, because that was written, shortly after her death, and the other one was written 20 years later. And of course, you're looking back at it with different opinion or nostalgia. Everybody paid in gold dust. They didn't take greenbacks at that time because they weren't worth very much out here in Montana. And she does, appear frequently in the accounts only as the Frenchwoman or the old Frenchwoman. So no idea. I did a search through as much as I could through the census on Ancestry and tried really hard to find out what her first name was. I hate to see her just go down in history as Mrs. Guillot, but I haven't been very successful in doing that. In 1868, she was found brutally murdered in her cabin, and her gold was gone, and so was her husband. So a couple of men were arrested by the vigilantes, and they were taken for trial in Deer Lodge, and they almost got lynched because of the popularity of the Frenchwoman, but it turned out that they had nothing to do with it. They just stopped at the cabin to get a breakfast on the way over to Helena, but her husband had disappeared. And so he was kind of a worthless guy anyway. He was a hard drinker, he was a domestic abuser, and so likely they probably got in a fight over the money or the gold that she'd been hoarding or whatever, and he killed her and took off. And it's probably a prudent thing for him to do because the vigilantes would have taken care of it for him, I think. I would bet they would. So, you never caught him, no one was ever brought to trial, but Mrs. Guillot's ghost was rumored to have haunted the cabin for many years afterwards until the cabin burned. But apparently there is a spot where you could tell where it was today, but it's on private land and we haven't gotten permission to go on there to look around because I'd sure like to do that. I'd like to write a bigger article about Mrs. Guillot because she does figure so prominently in the literature of the time that it'd be nice to kind of clear up some of the misconceptions about her. Now, after her death in 1868, let's see if I can go ahead. Oh, here we go. This is what you can see of the Frenchwoman's Road in Google Earth. This is it right here. And here's the beacon right here. And so my goal is with Rich Buswell at some time, he wants to do this, and I want to take my dog along too, but her legs are kind of short, is I'd really like to walk the Frenchwoman's Road. And you can see it. You can walk it on the east side. I mean, it's a lot more easier to follow on the east side than it is on the west. But through aerial photos, you can still follow her route today. So in 1868, a man named Elijah Dumphy took over operation of the road. It was still a toll road. It was chartered by Lewis and Clark County and by Powell County. And Dumphy had been an employee of Constant Guillot, and so he was already familiar with the road. And so by 1876, he'd hired or appointed or assigned one of his employees, a man named Alexander McDonald, to collect the tolls on the road while Dumphy worked on his sawmill that was over, I believe it was on this side of the divide. But this is the toll house for the road when Dumphy and Alexander McDonald were operating it. It's still there. It's on private property along Clawson Road. You can still see it, and so that's one of the last of the toll gates that still exist here in Montana that you can actually see today. But Alexander McDonald eventually lost the charter. But one thing that's important is that the pass kept his name. And so we know it as McDonald Pass today, even though he wasn't the originator and was just the manager of the toll road for a while. So there was a fairly good road going over the top by the 1920s. This photo is taken here on this side of the divide. You can still you can recognize the hills here in the background, and everybody looks like they're having a good time. But you'll also notice, someone had noted before, the roads were kind of narrow. I mean, even the automobile roads at that time were pretty narrow as well. And the further you get up the pass, the less opportunities you're going to have to pull over and let somebody else go by. And then it was improved in the early 1930s, late 1920s, early 1930s. You want a quick family history about it? This is kind of a good story. Bruce, I hope this is okay. My great-grandparents homesteaded on this side of McDonald Pass, where Sweeney Creek is, just across from where Rimini Road comes into US Highway 12. And my grandfather was a surveyor on this project for the Bureau of Public Roads. And so he kept stopping at the farm down, the ranch down there to get water, and he fell in love with my grandmother, and they got married. And in the process, it worked out all right for my great-grandfather during the Depression. And he owns horses, and so if you had horses, you could operate scrapers and that type of thing under road construction. So he made more money than everybody else, so I guess that's a good thing. But I always thought that was great. My grandmother met my grandfather on a road project, and that's how I met my wife as well. And so I think that's why my grandmother liked my wife so much, is because they both kind of came from the same background as she did. So this is what the road looked like in the 1950s. I believe this photo was taken. Some of you will remember it when it was a two-lane route. It was pretty hairy, wasn't it? On July 20th, 1969, we were coming back from Polson visiting some of my mother's family, and my dad came flying down McDonald Pass on this side, trying to get us back home to see Neil Armstrong step off the lunar excursion module on television in time. And we made it, but I think we'd all had wet ourselves in the process. And I don't think I'd ever been so scared in my life when he was hauling butt down that road. So all his family history tied with McDonald Pass. It's probably why I like it so well. Here's another view of it. It was kind of scary in the summer. It's bad enough now in the winter, and it was really bad in the winter in those days. My family's homestead is right down below what they call the Three Sisters here, is right down in there. So, okay, and you've all seen this building. It looks a little bit different now. In 1936, the Department of Transportation took over maintenance of McDonald Pass from the federal government, because it was on a forest that the feds were responsible for it. And one of the first things we did was build this section house up on McDonald Pass, and they kept snow plows here, and that was a guy essentially living on site to plow the road as they needed it. And that is still a man that lives there with his family today, and he does the same thing. He's up there to take care of the road in the wintertime. He lives in the old section house, which this is the first section house built by the Highway Department and on its system. All right, I'm getting close to the end. Sand house that used to be up there. I vaguely remember this. And then finally, how am I doing for time, Kirby? I'm done. I don't know. Quarter after? Well, I'm doing all right then. All right, now this is where I do a shameless plug. I have a book coming out, and I don't like to write them very often because they're a lot of work, and I'd rather do articles because they're a lot shorter. But it's about history of transportation here in Montana. It comes out the end of next month, and this is what the cover looks like. And I don't know if anybody will buy it, but the cover looks great. So, so that's just my shameless plug. So with that, that's basically all the roads that led into Helena. There was also a road that came up from the south that follows pretty much I-15 today, that went over the divide at Boulder Hill, and then the road down to Virginia City kind of angled off along Montana Highway. I don't remember the name of the number of the highway. The highway between Whitehall and Boulder. The shortcut down there, that was pretty much the route of the old Wagon road down to Virginia City. And then that road connected with the road from Utah. So Helena was sitting in a pretty good place in the 1860s, that we were at the crossroads. We did have connections to all the major highways or roads at that time. And so that was one of the reasons Helena did as well as it did, because it had a good transportation system to back it up. And that's one of the reasons why we're still here today. I mean, we're not like Virginia City where we were at the end of the road, and Urbanic where you're way off the road. And so that's really contributed to Helena's permanence as well. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll do my best. Yes, sir.